let's go. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tobias, and thanks, Adrian, for the invite. I'm sad that we're not all together to do this. This was originally planned, but
yeah,
it's working really well online as well. I'm curious to see what you make of my arguments. What I want to try to do today is to show that psychopathology needn't have a scaling up problem, or at least when we think about the particular case of delusions, and I'm going to be talking about delusions in the context of schizophrenia, so what are sometimes called polythematic delusions rather than monothematic delusions. We can see actually how to make sense of them using concepts that we've developed in the skilled intentionality framework, which is a conceptual framework for an ecological inactive cognitive science. But first of all, let me just say a little bit about the scaling up problem and how you might think about it. So back in 2009, Zoe Drayson wrote a paper about how to think about psychopathology within embodied cognitive science. And she spent quite a lot of time in that paper spelling out what embodied cognitive science is, giving us a review of a bunch of books that had been published around the time she was writing. And the last part of her paper, she then turns to think about how this idea of embodied cognition might apply to psychopathologies. And the notion of embodied cognition that she's using, we can think of in terms of what Michael Wheeler calls special purpose adaptive couplings to the environment. So the idea is that cognition is embodied because it depends on our sensory motor couplings with the environment. So playing squash is the central example that Mike Wheeler discusses. And so there's a tight coupling between the embodied agent's sensory motor behavior and the environment when you're playing that game. And there are special purpose capacities which we might think of as being softly assembled on the fly out of neural, bodily, and environmental elements. And what Drayson suggests in that paper is that embodied cognitive science can certainly provide better explanations of some psychopathology. She gives as examples body dysmorphia or eating disorders. But she thinks that embodied cognitive science has more of a problem when it comes to explaining something like delusion, which she thinks is characterized by offline cognition, where offline cognition we can define as a kind of cognition where there's reasoning about something distal, so something that the agent isn't currently coupled with in the environment, something that's absent, something that's abstract, or something that's merely possible. In all of these cases, she thinks it's going to be more difficult to see how to apply embodied style explanations. And she gives us an example, delusion, delusional belief formation, as a case in which she thinks it's going to be hard for embodied cognitive science to explain. And I want to take up that example today in my talk, that particular case, and show why I think embodied cognitive science does have something to say about delusional belief formation. And so when it comes to scaling up to offline cognition, at least for that particular case, there isn't an obstacle. Now, that's not to say that there aren't going to be other problems that we could come up with, examples of psychopathologies where it looks like it might be difficult to give an embodied style explanation, but at least that opens up the space for a research program that is attempting to address this worry. So what are delusions? Well, in the older definition and the DSM, delusions were defined as false beliefs that were based on incorrect inferences of some kind, but that nevertheless were firmly sustained by subjects. even when they were presented with contradictory evidence from others in their community, and the delusional subject continues to maintain that false belief. In the more recent version of the DSM, the requirement that the belief is false has been dropped, and instead of thinking of the false belief as about external reality, and now there's no longer a requirement that the belief is about an external reality. It could be about yourself, or it could be about some other kind of reality. So it needn't be the shared public world that you are entertaining a delusional belief about. So what's characteristic of a delusion, according to the new DSM, is that there's a fixed belief which is not updated, not changed in the light of conflicting evidence. And if you take that definition of delusions, you can see why one might think that there's a problem here for any non-representational approach to cognitive science. Because the most natural way to think about a delusion that does not match up with reality is that the subject has some kind of internal representation that is mistaken, that is misrepresenting the external world. So it looks like delusions are at least best characterized in representational terms if we think of them as beliefs and that are mistaken in some sense, or even if we drop the requirement that they're mistaken, still it looks like there's some kind of mismatch between what the delusional subject thinks and the way things are in the world. At least if there's evidence that's contrary to the belief, then there must be something going wrong with delusional belief. And whatever's going wrong, it's natural to think about in terms of states that are misrepresenting the external world. Now, yesterday we had a discussion after Adrian's talk about the possibility of thinking of delusions as representations, but nevertheless holding that the processes that lead to the production of that representational state are themselves non-representational. So we can come back to that in discussion if you think that's a possible way out here that would avoid any need to introduce representations in the explanation of delusions. I take it that's a possible way out of the problem here. But even if we do take that option and we think delusions are misrepresentations in some sense, still we would have the difficulty of scaling up from cognitive processes that are non-contentful, that don't involve any operation on content-bearing states, to products which are content-bearing in that they are able to misrepresent the external world. So I take it there would still be a scaling up problem, even if we take that option of avoiding appealing to representations in the explanation of how delusions are formed. We would still have to explain how you get content out of something that's non-contentful. I want to explore an alternative option. And I'm going to try to defend two claims today. The first is that we needn't think of delusion as the outcome of any kind of neurological or information processing dysfunction. Because I want to argue that it is not really helpful to think of delusion in terms of something that's present in normal subjects that's malfunctioning, or the deficit of something that's present in normal subjects. What that gets wrong, I think, is the way in which delusions are characterized by a completely different way of being in the world, a fundamental transformation in the structure of our lived experience. So the first point I want to make is that is the phenomenological point, that we should think of delusion not in terms of something that's absent but that's present in us, namely an information processing function or a neurological function that's gone wrong somehow in delusional subjects. I think instead we need to think of delusion as a positive experiential phenomenon in its own right, and try and make sense of that difference in lived experience that people undergo when they are subject to delusions. And the second claim I want to make is that that fundamental change in the way of being in the world, that change in the structure of lived experience, when we look for an explanation in cognitive science, it's going to be an explanation that is partly bodily. So by bodily, I mean here not just neural, but involving the whole body of the organism, the whole living body. And that it's also going to require us to give an environment involving explanation. So a kind of externalist explanation, if you think that externalist explanations are wide in the sense of invoking environmental factors. And of course, what I'm going to plug into the environmental side of things is the notion of affordances, because that's one of the concepts that we employ in the skilled intentionality framework. Okay, so I wanted to start with the first claim that we should think of delusions in terms of not just this breakdown of some neurological or information processing function, but rather as a change in the way of being in the world that delusional subjects undergo. And I think we can already see this nicely in this quote from Blankenberg, from a schizophrenic subject. The subject reports that there's something that's really important that's changed in their experience. And they say something so small, so comic, but so unique and important that you cannot live without it. So what is it? And they go on to describe it as their rootedness or footing in the world. They're having lost a hold on the simplest everyday things. And Blankenberg describes this in terms of a loss of natural self-evidence, or a loss of what Edmund Husserl called the natural attitude. And so that change in the way of being in the world that I think we have to start from is this loss of certainty in the world, this loss of the natural attitude, which is your ordinary, everyday, taken for granted assumptions that the world exists, that other people exist, that they have existed for a long time. These are just everyday, taken for granted assumptions that we all operate with. And that is somehow disturbed in schizophrenia. And I think the result of that, as many phenomenological psychopathologists have argued, is a completely different way of being in the world. So what's disturbed in delusion, I want to say, is not belief update processes that operate in us ordinarily, but are now somehow malfunctioning in the delusional subject. No, what's disturbed is rather a more fundamental background understanding, as I'm going to call it, on the basis of which one inhabits a familiar world. Once that background understanding is disturbed, then one no longer relates to a world that's meaningful, that makes sense. And one has to instead find new ways of making sense. And that's where delusions come from. So I'm still going to talk about delusional beliefs, even though I think that what's wrong in delusion is not a belief, but rather a disturbance in this background understanding. But I think, yeah, the delusional subject still takes the world to be a certain way. And we can think of belief states as states in which a subject takes the world to be a certain way. So what's different about delusions from ordinary beliefs is that they're no longer anchored in a shared, meaningful world in the way that our ordinary beliefs are. Our ordinary beliefs, we can go to others for testimony, We can critically reflect on our beliefs with others. We can rely on others to correct us. All of this is lost to somebody that's subject to a delusion. I'm suggesting that the reason that that's lost is because of this breakdown in background understanding. So that's the thing that I want to focus on in the rest of my talk. I'm going to try to argue that background understanding can be understood using the skilled intentionality framework. So that gives us a way of connecting maybe what's changed in delusion in terms of the subjects being in the world back to naturalistically describable processes, processes which can be characterized using concepts from 4E cognitive science. So by background understanding, I don't mean propositional beliefs. So John Campbell, for instance, draws on similar ideas from Wittgenstein to those that I want to employ, but he takes delusions to be a kind of propositional belief that top-down changes how subjects perceive and experience the world. Following Ratcliffe, I want to disagree with Campbell that background understanding can be thought of in terms of propositional beliefs, and instead think about background understanding as something that is practical, that is tied to our skillful ways of engaging with the world. So Wittgenstein here says, in characterizing basic trust or certainty, that it's not possible to investigate everything and look for justification for everything. Eventually, we're going to reach bedrock assumptions, and he calls these bedrock assumptions hinge propositions. And I'm suggesting that it's those hinge propositions which are disturbed in delusion, and but the hinge propositions themselves should be thought of in terms of practical modes of understanding or engaging with the world. So should be understood in terms of skills. So now we can begin to build some bridging concepts that take us from these phenomenological ideas that, that there's this loss of rootedness in a shared public world. There's this loss of what I've been calling background understanding, and connect that phenomenological idea of a different way of being in the world to concepts in cognitive science that could be used to naturalistically make sense of delusion. So that's what we get from the skilled intentionality framework. It provides us with bridging concepts that connect a living organism in its environment, that could be a human or it could be other animals, to living subjectivity, the lived body, as described in phenomenology. Delusion is a disturbance of bodily being in the world through this loss of background understanding. So my project in the paper today is to try to make sense of that loss of basic trust or the loss of the natural attitude in terms of a disturbance of skilled intentionality. So that's what I want to do in the rest of my talk. So I said that the skilled intentionality framework, and I'm just going to call it SIF from now onwards, provides bridging concepts that allow us to connect phenomenology back to naturalistically describable processes that can be characterized in the terms of cognitive science. So the first concept we need here is the concept of affordances. So here's Husserl describing the life world. He says, in the life world, we encounter things like pictures, statues, gardens, houses, tables, clothes, tools. These are all value objects of various kinds. So what we perceive are objects that have value and meaning to us. And this meaning can be how we can make practical use of those objects, but it needn't be just about practical use. And the idea here is just that the things that we encounter in the life world are things that have value and meaning. So what we perceive are objects in terms of their value and meaning. Now, the notion of affordance from ecological psychology provides a bridging concept between the life world as it's characterized by Husserl and the natural world as it would be described by ecological psychology or other branches of psychology. So we can think of the environment as meaningful in the phenomenological sense, or made up of objects that have value for us, because of the affordances that it provides. And the concept of affordance here will be a bridging concept that can help us to connect phenomenology to cognitive science. I want to do the same thing for background understanding. Indeed, that's, I think, what Eric, Yalla, and myself were up to when we introduced the notion of skilled intentionality. We were trying to provide a concept for cognitive science, so a framework, a set of assumptions of cognitive science that could help us to make sense in naturalistic terms, in the terms of an ecological enactive cognitive science, this notion of background understanding. That notion has been problematic for classical cognitive science to make sense of. We see this most obviously in the frame problem, in the relevance problem that artificial intelligence researchers ran into. And we think that an argument could be made for a non-classical post-cognitivist approach to cognitive science by attempting to take this notion of background understanding from phenomenology and give a cognitive science explanation of it. So what does that explanation look like? Well, we think that background understanding can be characterized in terms of selective responsiveness to multiple inviting affordances. That's what skilled intentionality is. Let me just see, 25 minutes I've been talking so far, right? So another 10 minutes or so, and then I should start to wrap up. Is that right,
20,
Adrian?
I have you at 22 minutes just gone, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you have more time.
So the notion of background understanding is a phenomenological notion which is introduced to account for our attitude of certainty that we have towards the world in our everyday experience, and how we are practically orientated and ready to engage with a meaningful world that we take for granted, we don't question, we don't doubt. We just go along with practices in virtue of which that world makes sense to us. And skilled intentionality was a concept we introduced to try to make sense of this practical engagement with the meaningful world in everyday life. The idea is that what we encounter, first of all, is a landscape of affordances, an ecological niche which is made up of affordances. And from those affordances, we select the affordances which are significant to us as individuals, that are relevant to us as individuals. And those relevant affordances, relevant action possibilities, then make up what we call a field of relevant affordances. So we're now on what will be the right-hand side of the figure. From the niche of possible affordances that we can act on, certain affordances stand out as inviting action, and those make up what we call a field of relevant affordances, which you can see here in a schematic form in terms of the colored rectangles. And those colored rectangles are depictions of the many affordances that are significant or relevant to us, which we are then ready to act on because of our skills. So the idea then is that certain affordances stand out as inviting to us, and we're ready to act on them in ways that are attuned to the particular situation in which we're acting because of the skills that we've developed in the past. And so we can make a distinction now between affordances and solicitations. Affordances are the meaningful possibilities for action that the ecological niche offers us, where the ecological niche is shared. It's the environment that we share with other humans, with other members of our practices. And so the abilities and skills relative to which affordances are defined, relative to which they take on their meaning, are defined in relation to abilities and skills that are available in a practice, in a community of individuals that take part in certain practices. Whereas what we call solicitations have a relevance or a significance to the individual because of the skills and abilities that the individual has developed by taking part in those practices, by being a member of a community of individuals that participate in practices. So the selective responsiveness of the individuals to multiple relevant affordances we can think of in terms of skills that connect or attune the individual to wider communal practices. Because the affordances that are available in the landscape of affordances are affordances that are formed in the practices or through the practices of our communities that we're members of, that we belong to. And it's this attunement of the individual's skills and abilities to those wider socio-cultural, socio-material practices that breaks down in delusion. So once we understand how the connection of individual skills to the wider community breaks down in delusion, that will be the basis for characterizing in terms of skilled intentionality, in terms of a disturbance of skilled intentionality, this loss of background understanding. So that's the key idea that I want to now expand on further. So going back to the phenomenological ideas, Sass introduced this notion of unwelding, drawing on Heidegger, to characterize the sense in which the world that the schizophrenic subject engages with has lost its practical significance. And the basis for this unwelding is this disturbance of ipseity or self-affection that Adrian was talking about yesterday. What happens as a consequence of this diminished or reduced self-affection, sometimes characterized as mindness, is that the subject experiences an alienation from their body, a kind of distancing from their body. They experience the body as empty, as lacking liveliness, as no longer being drawn by affordances in the environment, if we put it in terms of skilled intentionality. Michel Maïs talks about a bodily alienation, which has disrupted the person's practical involvement with the world. And my suggestion is that self-affection, mindness, can be thought of in terms of a subject being oriented in a space of significant possibilities. And here I'm drawing on Matthew Ratcliffe's work, again on existential feelings. So the sense of mindness that the subject has for their own experiences, thoughts, and actions comes from the being oriented in this space of possibilities. It comes from what we can characterize in phenomenological terms as an anticipation fulfillment structure that experience has. And so long as your anticipations are fulfilled, so long as the possibilities that you're ready for, that you anticipate, are fulfilled when you act, then the result of that is this mindness. But that's diminished or reduced in schizophrenia, leading to a subject being distanced from their practical involvement with the world. They're losing their attunement to this shared space of possibilities, to this landscape of affordances. And the loss of attunement to the landscape of affordances has this consequence that the subject begins to operate on a field of relevant affordances that is no longer connected with the wider landscape, the wider environment that we share with other people. And they begin to inhabit what Sass talks about as a kind of solipsistic reality. So back to bridging concepts again. I've characterized the loss of basic trust, loss of background understanding, or disturbance of background understanding, using this notion of a space of possibilities that we're oriented in from Matthew Ratcliffe. And Ratcliffe takes that space of possibilities to be tied to self-affection, tied to mindness. And so the idea is that ordinarily our bodily feelings open us to a space of possibilities in which some of those possibilities are inviting to us because of the skills and abilities we've developed by taking part in shared socio-cultural practices. Those socio-cultural practices give us a sense of how to act, how to go along with others that take part in those practices. But that sense of being oriented in a space of possibilities is disturbed in schizophrenia, with the consequence that the person is ready to do things, ready to engage with the world in particular ways, but they're no longer moved to engage with the world in ways that connect them to shared ways of making sense of the world that come from participating in shared socio-cultural communal practices. So self-affection or bodily feeling here is situating the individual in a space of significant possibilities ordinarily, but that breaks down in schizophrenia. So think of fear. When you're scared, that's an emotion that you're undergoing, but that emotion can actually imbue the whole situation with an experience of the situation as threatening. And generally, what existential feelings or bodily feelings do is situate us in the world in a particular way, so that the situation as a whole takes on a particular experiential character based on our existential feelings, based on our bodily feelings. And it's those existential feelings that, according to Ratcliffe, are transformed in schizophrenia. And we try to now make a bridge between that phenomenological description and ecological enactive cognitive science, using the notion of action readiness, which we borrow from the emotion psychologist Nico Freider. So the idea is that these states of action readiness are anticipatory. What you're ready for is engaging with relevant, inviting affordances. And you're ready because of those skills that orient you to a shared space of meaningful possibilities, a landscape of affordances. But in schizophrenia, that anticipatory readiness for inviting affordances is fundamentally disturbed. And the result of that is then that the subject is no longer attuned to the wider communal practices in terms of what they're ready to do. Often negative symptoms in schizophrenia are characterized by the subject being apathetic and not being ready for anything. I characterized that earlier in terms of an emptiness or a lack of liveliness in the body. But there are also positive symptoms in which the subject is ready to do things, but what they're ready to do doesn't any longer connect to the wider landscape of affordances, the shared space of possibilities that we inhabit because of our participation in social communal practices.
That's just you on 35 minutes now. Just the
okay, I'm
reminder.
reaching the end, so that's good. So the proposal then is to provide, to use skilled intentionality framework to provide bridging concepts that help us to make naturalistic sense of this breakdown in background understanding that is characteristic of delusions. And so the key concept we use in our work on psychopathology more generally is this idea of the field of relevant affordances. So our ambition is to make sense of psychopathologies using, well, by appeal to how subjects, how individuals experience inviting affordances. So normally there are multiple relevant affordances that we are responsive to. We characterize that at the top of the figure here in terms of there being a field that has width, depth, and height. And the width relates to the multiple possibilities we're ready for. The depth is relating to the anticipation fulfillment structure, the readiness for multiple possibilities, both here in the present and going into the future. And the height relates to the significance of each of these possibilities. So how much are we preparing to act on those affordances now or in the future? To what extent is the affordance attracting us or repelling us? And in earlier work that Sannika de Haan has done with Eric and Damian Denise, they have employed this framework to make sense of OCD and depression. And what I've been doing today is attempting to characterize how the field of affordances is unhinged from the wider landscape of affordances in schizophrenic delusion. So normally what we see in our engagement with the wider world is that the affordances that invite us as individuals do so because of skills we've developed as participants in shared social communal practices. So the inviting affordances are contributing to a continuation of the affordances, a maintaining of the affordances that are available in the landscape. So in our figure here, you see that in terms of how the arrows are feeding into each other. There's a reciprocal relation of dependence between the field and the wider landscape, where the affordances that are available in the field are made available because of possibilities for action that have formed in the past in the landscape of affordances. But the affordances belonging to the field are themselves contributing to the maintaining and sustaining of those affordances in the wider landscape. What happens in schizophrenia is that reciprocal dependence of the field and the landscape is broken, and the individual starts to be invited by affordances that no longer connect them to the wider shared social communal practices. So that's the core idea that I've been presenting today. I want to finish up now with just a quick objection, a couple of objections actually. So the first objection is one that Ratcliffe made in his book on depression and has more recently followed up on in a paper with Matthew Broome called Beyond Salience and Affordance. And the objection is basically, I mean, you can read the quote here, but the worry is that the notion of inviting affordances or solicitations is just too coarse grains to really help us to make sense of the phenomenology. I think if what we were trying to do is reduce the phenomenology to responsiveness to affordances, to relevant affordances, then there might be something to Ratcliffe's objection. But that's not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to say that all of the different ways in which the space of significant possibilities can be disturbed by schizophrenia, we can now identify with responsiveness to affordances. The idea rather is that we can take this phenomenological description that Ratcliffe gives beautifully and provide bridging concepts using the skilled intentionality framework that help us to make sense of this loss of rootedness in the world, this loss of background understanding. So affordances and solicitations are not supposed to take over the work of phenomenology. They're supposed to give us a way of making naturalistic sense of what's being described in phenomenology. So there's no competition between our skilled intentionality framework and the work that Ratcliffe is doing. On the contrary, we think both descriptions, both frameworks are needed, the phenomenological framework and the ecological inactive framework that we get from the skilled intentionality framework. Both are needed to make naturalistic sense of what kind of disturbance in lived experience happens in delusion. And the second objection I want to raise, which I think would be interesting to talk about, is double bookkeeping. So delusional subjects might believe in some sense that there's a doctor that's poisoning their food, but nevertheless eat the food that's given to them. So there seems to be a mismatch between how the world is drawing them into action, that they're being drawn into eating the food. The food is still relevant to them, still inviting them if they're hungry, and the delusion that they're subject to. And I just want to float the possibility that Sean Gallagher has raised, that we might be able to make sense of this in terms of delusional subjects inhabiting multiple realities. So the life world of the delusional subject that I've suggested has now somehow come unhinged from the landscape of affordances. We can think of as a lived experience of reality that that the subject can go into and come out of in the same way as you might enter into a fictional world in reading a novel or watching a movie or playing a computer game. Similarly, the delusional subject can move in and out of this field of relevant affordances that's unhinged from the landscape of affordances, and then go back into a field of relevant affordances that is reciprocally related in the way that is normally the case to the wider landscape of affordances. And the question then is, well, can we make sense of that delusional reality that the subject experiences using this notion of selective responsiveness to relevant affordances? I think we can, but we would need to think of there as being some kind of mismatch between that reality and the wider shared reality. And that's what I've been trying to make sense of in this talk in terms of the field coming unhinged from the wider landscape. So what I tried to do today is to give you some concepts for making sense of this loss of basic trust in schizophrenia in naturalistic terms. So I wanted to characterize delusions not as the result of some kind of dysfunctional belief update process like is done in cognitive neuropsychiatry typically, but to argue that we need to think of delusions as disturbances of the structure of lived experience that come about because of a disturbance in this wider background understanding. And I've suggested that we can think of that wider disturbance in background understanding as the result of a breakdown of the anticipation fulfillment structure of lived experience that typically orients us in a space of shared possibilities that we are able to anticipate because of our history of engaging in shared communal practices. And as soon as that orientation in that shared space of possibilities is lost, then the result is this kind of bodily alienation and distancing from the world that can eventually lead to the subject inhabiting a lived reality, a life world that is isolated in some sense from the wider shared communal reality that we inhabit because of our situatedness in a landscape of affordances. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.